Theodore Roosevelt came here to kill a buffalo, but he fell in love with the country.
And he won the grudging respect of his neighbors, but eventually they came to like this guy and be rather attached to this strange character from the East.
Roosevelt would have been dead like that in a duel.
He loved the outdoors, he loved the environment, he loved hunting. All these things were available for him here.
When you do a biography of Roosevelt, his Badlands chapters, I think it's the coming of age one. It's the turning of a page.
Theodore Roosevelt came to the Dakota Territories, and he pushed himself and he hardened himself physically and emotionally, and he relied on that for the rest of his life.
This program was made possible by grants from the North Dakota Humanities Council, the Southwest Rural Economic Partnership, the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame, and was produced in cooperation with Prairie Public Broadcasting.
The Badlands of North Dakota. Rugged buttes, canyons, grass plateaus, a river called the Little Missouri that meanders slowly north towards the Big Missouri. Sunlight dances off the buttes like a ballet, and winds blow gently through the grass, across the plateaus, and through the ravines. 65 million years ago, the Badlands was home to the dinosaur. Herds of Triceratops and the mighty T-Rex roamed what was then a swamp-like land. 35 million years ago, Mesohippus, the three-toed, 3-foot-high ancestor of today's horse, called this land home. Then 1,000 years ago, buffalo and the American Indian claimed the Badlands. In the 1870s, trail drivers pushed their herds north from Texas to graze the rich grasses of this Little Missouri Valley. This quickly became cowboy country, a place for men with big hats, chaps, guns, and whose heads danced with big dreams as they explored the open range. This is a place of rugged beauty in the spring and summer, but treacherous in the winter, when blowing snow and bitter winds make it dangerous for the people and animals who live here. Coyotes howl into the north winter wind, and life slows on the frozen landscape. The winds eventually calm, days become longer, Alberta clippers stay in Canada. The snow melts, and the waters run into the Little Missouri. The prairie flowers push through the gumbo, and the grass again turns green. And when spring returns to the Badlands, hope is eternal. The newborn buffalo, deer, elk, calves, and colts take their first shaky steps. It was into this land in the fall of 1883 that a young whirlwind by the name of Theodore Roosevelt stepped off the train at the town that was then called Little Missouri. The 25-year-old Roosevelt loved guns and the outdoors. He considered himself a naturalist and had come to Dakota Territory to hunt and study wildlife. Where there were once millions of buffalo, now there were few. And when the dandy from New York jumped off that train, he was determined to shoot one of the few remaining shaggy giants.
One of the great misnomers that people have is somehow hunting is not synonymous with conservation. Most of your first-rate hunters are conservationists. They're the first people to really care about species survival, ecosystems staying intact.
Theodore Roosevelt was born a New York blue blood in a Victorian era. He was frail, sickly, and advised not to plan on living a full or active life. But Roosevelt saw himself as a Renaissance man. He loved and lived life with gusto. He was captivated by nature, but was also scholarly. He had attended Harvard, where by sheer force of will, he overcame life-threatening asthma. He was also a man of contradictions, a serious author, a prude when it came to personal matters, but a man who loved guns and blood sports. And despite personal wealth, he was a political reformer. Born on the cusp of the Civil War in 1858, Theodore Roosevelt would live to be 60 and the most vigorous and forceful man ever to occupy the White House. He was a trustbuster, a conservationist, a flag waver who celebrated the 4th of July every day. His motto, speak softly, but carry a big stick. Theodore Roosevelt began his climb to greatness in 1880. He graduated from Harvard, married, and within a year was elected to the New York legislature. He also wrote an acclaimed account of the Naval War of 1812 that is still considered a tour de force.
TR got interested in politics, I think, partially because he felt a responsibility. He saw that politics in New York in the 1800s, late 1800s, was being run by a different type of person. These were the immigrant machine kind of politicians. And he heard a lot of people complaining, as they do today, about politics. His view is you can't complain about it unless you get involved in it.
Roosevelt's trip west to the Badlands to shoot his buffalo would change his life forever. For here he would rub elbows with the people of the West, the cowboys, the homesteaders. It is here he would develop and refine his thoughts about creating a democratic society that was fair to all. When he stepped off the train in the Badlands, he was considered snobbish, a dilettante, a man who expected the finer things in life. But reality was waiting. The only sleeping quarters were at a building called the Pyramid Park Hotel. Theodore Roosevelt spent the night of September the 7th, 1883, in a large room filled with bunks, bed bugs, and a dozen other snoring, likely liquored-up, gun-packing cowboys. The most popular place in Whittle, Missouri was the saloon called Big Mouth Bob's Bug Juice Dispensary. The clientele, dubious. The whiskey, bad. The house special was called 40-Mile Red-Eye, which wasn't much for taste, but as one local wag put it, it gets the job done. Roosevelt was a teetotaler, a sarsaparilla man, and it's doubtful he ever set foot in Bob's because he had come to hunt a buffalo, and he quickly hired a local named Joe Ferris as a guide and was off to the hunt. For Ferris, the trip turned into 10 days of pure hell. Cold weather, rain, wind, and slick, sticky gumbo mud. The seasoned Ferris wanted to go home, but Roosevelt insisted on continuing his hunt.
They've been out for 8 or 9 days. They've had nothing but bad luck. And now they camp out on the plains, and that night it rains, and they wake up at dawn, literally, in pools of water. And Ferris looks over at this kid from New York and thinks, finally, he'll quit. Roosevelt sits up in that pool of water and looks over at Joe Ferris and says, by Godfrey, this is fun. And up they get, and they go doggedly off, and the next day, Roosevelt finds one of the last buffalo in Dakota Territory and shoots it and kills it.
He was a terribly driven man. When he set an objective, whether it was Panama or whatever it might be politically, he had to complete it or he looked at himself as a failure. And not getting a buffalo was not in the cards. He had to get one.
During his long and difficult hunt, Roosevelt stayed at the Gregor Lang Ranch. The Lang cabin was little more than a shanty, but Roosevelt was a courteous and appreciative guest and made a big impression on his host. He would accept no special treatment, called every humble meal a banquet, and slept on the dirt floor rather than deprive anyone else of a bed. Each night after supper, the New York blue blood talked into the wee hours with Lang, a Scottish immigrant. Years later, Lang's son Lincoln Lang, in his book called Ranching with Roosevelt, recalled that as a youngster, he laid awake in the loft, entranced by the conversations between his father and the young hunter and scholar as the two sat before the fire, talking until dawn.
In Roosevelt's forceful talk lay not only conviction, but a depth of interest that kept me wanting to hear more. And as I listened, I learned. Learned, for example, that while the world was a good place to live in, just as I had been thinking, there were, to shear the frill, a whole lot of rooting hogs loose in it. Among other things, his talk forcefully impressed upon me that he favored making 2 blades of grass grow where but one grew before. He believed in live and let live, believed that the way to pull himself up was not to make a stepping stone of the other fella, but rather join hands and pull together that both might rise easier. Altogether, he was with us 10 or 12 days upon that first occasion. When he left, we were genuinely sorry to see him go. As he rode away in the wake of the wagon bearing the head and the hide of his skill, well do I recall Father saying to me, "There goes the most remarkable man I've ever met." Unless I'm badly mistaken, the world is due to hear from him one of these days.
"1883 was also the year another aristocrat discovered the Badlands. The Marquis de Moore was a French nobleman who married money and developed an audacious business idea. De Moore planned to raise beef, slaughter them in his own packing plant located in the town that he'd named for his wife, Medora. The processed meat would then be shipped to eastern markets in the newly invented refrigerated rail cars. A superb hunter, skilled swordsman, and crack shot, the haughty aristocrat promptly hired hundreds to begin work on his packing plant. Built a chateau for his family, a hotel, housing for employees and relatives, a store, a newspaper called the Badlands Cowboy, and a stage line that ran from Medora to the goldfields of the Black Hills. While the Marquis was trying to build an empire, Roosevelt hunted the Badlands. He was captivated with the land, its people, freedoms, and the character of the range-riding cowboys. Before boarding a train for the return trip to New York, he bought what was called the Chimney Butte Ranch south of Medora and retained the Maltese Cross brand as his own. Roosevelt was excited about the new Badlands ranching venture. It was yet another way of proving himself and a way to become a Dakota cowboy.
Roosevelt came here to kill a buffalo, but he fell in love with the country. The frontier was officially being declared closed by the U.S. Census Bureau, and he wanted to get a little infusion of that frontier experience before it disappeared forever.
But he was also fascinated with the type of people that lived here, with the cowboy life, with ranching. He saw it as a business opportunity. He was a pretty naive businessman. It turned out to be a disaster. So he saw all these possibilities, and I think other things that he didn't see that became truth about it. He loved the outdoors, he loved the environment, he loved hunting. All these things were available for him here.
Buffalo head in tow, the eager hunter and new rancher headed for home in the rough and tumble politics of New York. By February, the young, strong-willed reformer was back in Albany, serving in the New York Legislative Assembly. There was pure Rooseveltian joy when word arrived from New York City that his wife of 4 years, Alice Lee, had given birth to a daughter. But tears of joy soon turned to concern when a second ominous telegram arrived with word that Alice, after giving birth, had turned desperately ill. He rushed for New York City and home, where he was met at the door by Brother Elliot, who said, "Theodore, there is a curse on this house." His beloved, darling Alice was dead from complications of childbirth. It was Valentine's Day, but there was nothing to celebrate, for not only had his wife Alice died, so had his loving mother.
When his first wife and his mother died on the same night, he had this incredible loss, this crippling loss, this loss that would have destroyed any man, a much lesser man. His approach, instead of crumbling, was to once again find the most difficult challenge, physical challenge he could, and that's when he came to the Dakota Territories, and he pushed himself and he hardened himself, I believe, physically and emotionally, and he relied on that for the rest of his life.
The sorrow and grief were unforgiving, and the young Roosevelt needed time and needed space. He made arrangements for his baby daughter Alice to stay with his sister Bammy. He packed his belongings and, with his grief, boarded the train for Dakota Territory. He was headed for the life of a rancher at a new ranch along the Little Missouri River north of Medora.
And he spent weeks, months trying to heal. It's difficult because he was a father now with a child. He needed to transition himself in some way. It wasn't an era where you had deep kinds of grief therapy or psychiatrists were commonplace. So you had to find a way to move forward on your own. And he found that by going west, by the solitude of the Maltese Ranch and Elkhorn Ranch. Gave him a chance to be by himself a lot. Often historians talk about TR going hunting and all these buddies. A lot of his time was spent in the solitude of the West, and that was where he was able to heal himself. He had time to think, time to walk, time to grieve.
He went on long solo hunts and spent days reading. He wrote parts of a couple of books there, and he brooded. This was the one period in his life when he was really filled with melancholy. And his closest friends tried to talk him out of his darkest thoughts during this period. While he was there, Roosevelt wrote the only tribute that he would ever produce to his first wife. In his 1913 autobiography, which is superb, he never even mentions her. And to his famous daughter Alice, he wouldn't talk about the mother that she never met. The tribute that he wrote was part of a small book of obituaries and other pieces of praise about Alice. And this is what he said. This is the only thing he ever wrote about his first wife. She was beautiful in face and form, and lovelier still in spirit. As a flower she grew, and as a fair young flower she died. Her life had always been lived in the sunshine, and there had never come to her a single great moment of sorrow, and none who ever knew her did but love and revere her for her bright, sunny temperament and her saintly unselfishness. Fair, pure, and joyous as a maiden, tender, loving, and happy as a young bride. When she had just become a mother, when it seemed as if her life had but just begun and the bright years seemed to stretch out before her, then by a strange and terrible fate, death came for her. And when my heart's dearest died, the light went out of my life forever.
But in addition to grieving for his loving wife and mother, the time along the Little Missouri may have also provided the future president time to consider his political situation.
The memories of the places and the time he had spent with Alice, his first wife, were very painful for him. With Roosevelt, though, there was almost always sort of a second reason for doing things. There was a political angle to it. The summer of 1884 was a good time for a Republican like Roosevelt to be gone from the East. The Republicans were trying to decide who they were going to nominate. They nominated James Blaine, who was a character with a rather checkered past. Roosevelt had made his reputation as a reformer in New York. And he had to make a basic decision. Do you support Blaine? And if you do, it would seem to give the lie to your devotion to reform. On the other hand, he was a Republican, and if he doesn't support Blaine, how's he going to expect Republican support of him in the future? So it was very convenient simply to leave. The Republican convention was held in Chicago, and he took the first train out of Chicago and headed for Dakota and disappeared into the wilds of the West. So newspapermen couldn't find him.
The rough and tumble frontier and the cowboys of the West were balm for the mournful aristocrat. His sanctuary became his Elkhorn Ranch. It was here that Theodore Roosevelt found the solitude he wanted and needed. He spent his evenings on a rocking chair on the front porch, gazing at the Little Missouri River, watching the sunset light up the buttes to the east. This was his place, his spot to meditate, write, heal his soul, and become a true man of the West. The Little Missouri ran through his ranching world. It was his connection with Medora and defined the boundaries of his ranch. Here he made friends with other cowboys and ranchers. There were roundups and social gatherings. Roosevelt had an interest in photography and brought a camera to Dakota Territory. He lugged the heavy camera from point to point, taking pictures of the Badlands, his ranch, his new life. He doubted his skill as a photographer, but some of his pictures survive and they tell a story. From across the river then to across the Little Missouri today. This was a working ranch, an investment, a business. There were stables and corrals. There was also his Elkhorn Ranch house, which he enjoyed. Looking at his photographs now, it is evident he wanted us to know that he was a real working cowboy. On the front porch, a rocking chair, his saddle. Perched above it, his pearl-handled six-gun. Men carried six guns in the West, and Roosevelt wanted others to know that this was a life that could be dangerous. It could also be a life filled with nature's beauty.
Throughout June, the thickets and groves about the ranch house are loud with bird noises from before dawn to long after sunrise. Thrashers have sung all the night through from among the thorn bushes if there has been a moon, or even if there has been bright starlight. And before the first glimmer of gray, the bell-like silvery songs of the shy woodland thrashers chime in, while the meadowlark, robin, bluebird, song sparrow, together with many rarer singers, like the grosbeak, join in, swelling the chorus.
Roosevelt was determined to experience the American West before it was gone. He was fascinated with the Badlands. He asked his friend, famed artist Frederick Remington, to use his pictures and writings to do sketches of life, wildlife, and the land he now lived in. He also asked Montana Territory photographer L.A. Huffman for help with his pictures. Huffman obliged and took photos of Roosevelt's ranch, cowboys, ranchers, and the Badlands.
The great free ranches, with their barbaric, picturesque, and curiously fascinating surroundings, mark a primitive stage of existence as surely as do the great tracts of primeval forest. And like the latter, must pass away before the onward march of our people. And we who have felt the charm of the life and have exulted in its abounding vigor and its bold, restless freedom, will not only regret its passing for our own sakes, but must also feel sorrow that those who came after us are not to see as we have seen. What is perhaps the pleasantest, happiest, and most exciting place of American existence.
This was the West before it was tamed. Medora and the Badlands were wild. To be successful here, it helped to be a good shot, something Theodore Roosevelt was not. But Roosevelt had grit.
T.R.'s shooting ability was interesting. He had very thick glasses, and there was always being misting over and covering it out, this and that and the other thing. He was not a good shot. Somebody asked him once, he was president, they said, "Mr. President, are you a good shot?" He said, "No, but I shoot often."
Bad shot or not, Theodore Roosevelt was no shrinking violet. Glasses or not, he would stand and deliver if his honor was challenged. On a visit to a town called Mingus,ville present-day Webo, Montana, a drunken gunslinger who had been terrorizing other patrons of a saloon and restaurant decided to have a little fun with the dude from back east who wanted only to order a meal. Roosevelt wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was looking for food and a bed after a long day in the saddle.
As soon as he saw me, he hailed me as Four Eyes, in reference to my spectacles, and said Four Eyes is going to treat. I joined in the laugh and got behind the stove and sat down, thinking to escape notice. He followed me, however, and though I tried to pass it off as a jest, this merely made him more offensive, and he stood leaning over me, a gun in each hand, using very foul language. In response to his reiterated command that I should set up the drinks, I said, well, if I've got to, I've got to, and rose looking past him. As I rose, I struck quick and hard with my right just to the side of the point of his jaw, hitting with my left as I straightened out, and then again with my right. He fired the gun, but I do not know whether this was merely a convulsive action of his hands or whether he was trying to shoot at me.
As the gunslinger goes down, two things occur. First, he hits his head on the back of the bar and passes out cold. But as he goes down, both pistols discharge. Roosevelt might have been killed. He takes a real joy in that later.
Don't hit at all if you can help it. Don't hit a man if you can possibly avoid it. But if you do hit him, put him to sleep.
Not only was he honest, but he faced up to problems. He faced them directly, and that was just in his nature, and it certainly played through his life. But there was one story of there was kind of a tough guy in Medora who was upset at TR over something, I don't remember what, and then started talking loudly about how the next time he's going to see him, he's going to shoot him on sight. Well, when TR is told this by one of his ranch hands, his immediate response was to get on his horse, ride over to this guy's house, pound on the door, and when the guy came to the door looking a little surprised, said, I hear you're going to shoot me on sight. Have you got anything to say, or should we get down to business? And the guy sort of taken back, said, oh, no, it was a mistake, it was a mistake. That was the end of it.
Roosevelt was fascinated with the people of the West, the rugged individuals who were making new lives for themselves on the new frontier. Over time, he gained a genuine respect for the common folks of the West that touched his soul and taught him valuable lessons about the meaning of true American democracy.
So when Roosevelt came west, he recognized that most people thought he was an Eastern dude. They wondered what he was doing here. He wore these very thick eyeglasses. You know, what's he doing out here? And he recognized that people were going to be testing him. And he concluded that he had to stand up to the test. And if he could prove himself in these initial tests, then people wouldn't bother him after that. So he probably walked around with a chip on his shoulder for the first while he was out here, essentially daring people to knock it off. And when they did, he stood up to him. And he won the, well, initially probably grudging respect of his neighbors, but eventually they came to like this guy and be rather attached to this strange character from the East. I think a lot of them never quite convinced themselves that he wasn't sort of strange, but still, he chose to come out here and he made himself one of them. It was something they could appreciate.
I had studied a lot about men and things before I saw you fellows, but it was only when I came here that I began to know anything or measure men rightly.
Theodore Roosevelt arrived at North Dakota as a physically challenged, as we'd say now, fellow who certainly looked like an Eastern dude and wore glasses, for Lord's sake, which was considered a sign of moral degradation here, but with tremendous energy. He threw himself into this, and it transformed him in many ways. His whole view about people changed. You read his letters when he was in college at Harvard, and you get this snobbish snot, you know, and he's talking about people and do they have enough money, and, you know, just really this, you know, very sort of effete, snotty New England type or Eastern type. And it was here that he discovered what real Americans were. And as a rancher, he played all the roles of the cowboy. On roundups, he would ride the circuit horses, he would do everything. He would be in the saddle 14, 18 hours a day. So it was partially self-proof. The first real chance of him to measure himself against people he really respected in their abilities and stand up to it. He also developed his view of America on a much larger scale than just the eastern seaboard.
Not only did he learn about people while working with the cowboys of the West, but he also learned to love the robust life of the outdoors.
Cowboys are known to each other only by their first names, with a prefix, the title of the brand for which they are working. Thus, I once remember overhearing a casual remark to the effect that Bar Y. Harry had married the 7 Open A girl, the latter being the daughter of a neighboring rancher. They are as hardy and self-reliant as any men who ever breathed, with bronze-set faces and keen eyes that look all the world straight in the face without flinching.
Roosevelt rode from dawn to dusk on the roundups. He might have been a dude with glasses, but he had grit and soon proved he could keep up with the best of hands. He never malingered, never shirked a task, no matter how dirty, difficult, or tiring. He was often the last to go to bed and the first to rise, and he never complained about injuries, aches, or pains.
On my first roundup, I had a string of 9 horses. 4 of the broncos only broken to the extent of having each been saddled once or twice. One of them, it was an impossibility to bridle or saddle single-handed. It was very difficult to get on him, and he was exceedingly nervous if a man moved his hands or feet, but he had no bad tricks. The second soon became perfectly quiet. The third turned out to be one of the worst buckers on the ranch. Once, when he bucked me off, I managed to fall on a stone and broke a rib. The fourth had a still worse habit, for he would balk and then throw himself over backward. Once, when I was not quick enough, he caught me and broke something in the point of my shoulder, so that it was some weeks before I could raise the arm freely.
His fascination with the cowboy culture was that it was rough and ready. These were, in the day, in the Victorian period, where manhood was very much emphasized. He had great respect for the cowboy, because the cowboy worked in the rain, worked in the dirt, worked under the worst conditions, but always triumphed, always got the job done.
Never mind the hail, rain, heat, and cold. He was now a cowboy, one of the men he thought honorable and he could relate to.
Once Roosevelt showed his grit and the merit of his integrity, whether he was a good shot or not wasn't what impressed them about Roosevelt. He had a great fiber to him, that this was a good guy, that you'd come back and say, this guy's smart, he's funny, he's decent, he's honest, he has integrity, and people started admiring those qualities about him.
If he wasn't working at a roundup, at the Elkhorn reading or writing a book, he often sat in his rocking chair gazing over the Little Missouri and the rugged bluffs that blended into the wide horizons. He was still grieving, but the beautiful Badlands were helping to recover his spirit and bring meaning back to his life.
These long, swift rides in the glorious spring mornings are not soon to be forgotten. The fresh, sweet air with a touch of sharpness this early in the day, and the rapid motions of the fiery little horse combine to make a man's blood thrill and leap with buoyant lightheartedness and eager, exultant pleasure in the boldness and freedom of the life he is leading. As we climb the steep sides of the first range of buttes, wisps of wavering mist still cling in the hollows of the valley. When we come out on the top of the first great plateau, the sun flames up over its edge, and in the level red beams the galloping horsemen throw fantastic shadows. Black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. At any rate, not when he first feels the horse move under him.
Well, it really started defining the character of Theodore Roosevelt. The Badlands was the discovery of America. Up until that time, he had made family trips to Egypt, he had traveled Europe, He certainly had spent time on the eastern seaboard, lived in New York, went to school in Harvard, went hunting in Maine. But seeing the Badlands and capturing what some people call the closing of the frontier or the end of a certain era out here, it gave him a taste of what it was like at the Battle of Little Bighorn, or what it would have been like while he was out here to have Sitting Bull still alive at a reservation not far away, and to have buffalo herds, the last indigenous ones, still roaming freely. He improved as a horse rider. He became a better shot out here, but more importantly, he started building his physical stamina up and his strength. So he used to say, Roosevelt, that without North Dakota, I wouldn't have been president. What he really was saying was, without those experiences and self-reliance, he wouldn't have had the fortitude to go forward and put together the Rough Riders, which was made up of Great Plains cowboys and Harvard dandies in some ways, or intellectuals. And that Rough Riders then became what his famous calling card was, Colonel Roosevelt.
While Roosevelt was becoming a cowboy, the other blue blood in Medora was the charismatic Marquis de Moore, who was busy building his cattle empire. He was a man to be reckoned with, quick-tempered, strong-willed, and always well-armed. The Marquis and Roosevelt were acquainted. Both were considered gentlemen. They had business dealings, but Roosevelt at one point refused to sell cattle to de Moores because he felt an agreement had not been honored. He became convinced the Frenchman was not always honest in his business dealings and decided never to do business with him again.
These two men were aristocrats, but one was a profoundly American aristocrat and the other one more of the European stamp. Roosevelt grew up with great privilege, but he came to the West to learn how to be a cowboy. He wanted desperately to fit in, and no part of him wanted to remind others of his social privilege, just the opposite. The Marquis had some pretensions to the French throne, and he took himself very seriously indeed and patronized and belittled all the people around him. It was inevitable that these two styles would be clear to everyone in the Badlands. And what strikes any historian is that eventually the cowboys of Dakota Territory learned to respect and even love Theodore Roosevelt. But nobody really loved the Marquis. In fact, most people openly despised him. And the only thing that got him anywhere he wanted to go in Dakota was the immense pool of money on which his investments lay.
Both were known as men who would not back down from a confrontation, and de Moores was always ready to defend his honor in a duel if necessary. They had dined together, exchanged books and favors in both Medora and New York City, but they were circumspect of one another, and the relationship was cool. Prior to Roosevelt's arrival in the Badlands, de Moores upset area residents by fencing open range he claimed as his own. This was considered very bad manners by locals. Tensions ran high among locals who felt they were being treated as serfs and servants rather than the independent ranchers and cowboys they were. The animosity and the tensions grew until gunfire erupted between the Marquis and his men and local cowboy Riley Lufsey and his friends below the bluffs just west of Medora. Lead flew. And when the smoke cleared, Lufsey lay dead. What had been a war of words now became a serious legal battle, with de Moores being accused of murder. Charges against the Marquis were filed and dropped twice, but he was indicted again and held in jail to await trial. The Marquis suspected Roosevelt was a key figure among those trying to have him brought to trial. There was tension, hard feelings, and as that conflict grew, de Moores sent a note to Roosevelt that many considered an invitation to a duel.
My principle is to take the bull by the horns. Joe Ferris is very active against me and has been instrumental in getting me indicted by furnishing money to witnesses and hunting them up. Is this done by your orders? I thought you my friend. If you are my enemy, I want to know it. I am always on hand, as you know, and between gentlemen it is easy to settle matters of that sort directly. Yours very truly, De Moore.
The letter that the Marquis de Moore wrote to Theodore Roosevelt, which was apparently a challenge over some issue about land, it certainly is true. And I suspect it all is true. The TR answered this. His approach to it was to write back, and that letter is extant too, and say that he was ready any time. Now, there was no question if TR had gotten in a duel with the Marquis de Moore, it was very unlikely that TR could have survived if de Moore had actually tried to kill him. And de Moore was a much better shot. TR couldn't see very well. There is the story that he said, well, let's do it at close range with rifles and making it as difficult for de Moore as possible.
Roosevelt viewed the letter as questioning his integrity and a threat. In case there was a duel, he asked his ranch foreman to act as his second, and because of his bad eyesight and poor marksmanship, he picked rifles at 12 paces as the weapon of choice. If they were going to duel, both would likely die. Having made his decision, Roosevelt quickly replied to de Moore's note.
Most emphatically, I am not your enemy. If I were, you would know it, for I would be an open one and would have not asked you to my house nor gone to yours. As your final words, however, seem to imply a threat, it is due to myself to say that the statement is not made through any fear of possible consequences to me. I, too, as you know, am always on hand and ever ready to hold myself accountable in any way for anything I have said or done. Yours very truly, Theodore Roosevelt.
Luckily for history, de Moores responded with a conciliatory note that Roosevelt interpreted as an apology.
The Marquis was a ruthless man who had killed others in duels before. He practiced his dueling arts. He would have beaten Roosevelt in any fair fight. And he was alone in the world by this time. He was in jail when he wrote this letter. He needed friends, and in a European way, he thought that the other aristocrat of the Badlands would be his ally. And it really upset him. I probably even hurt his feelings that Roosevelt wasn't supporting him in any meaningful way.
Roosevelt would have been dead like that in a duel. And I think that that really shows that he wasn't afraid of anything, but sometimes sort of foolishly not afraid.
Roosevelt spent much of the winter of '85 and '86 in New York. With snow melting in the Badlands, he boarded a train and in the spring of '86 returned to his beloved Elkhorn Ranch. Upon arrival, he discovered thieves had stolen his small boat. This was no small matter to Theodore Roosevelt. He was incensed. Blood was up. The chase was on. Ordering his ranch hands to build another boat, Roosevelt and the makeshift posse quickly began the chase. The thieves had a 6-day head start, but within 3 days, Roosevelt and his men caught up with the hapless trio of lawbreakers. Wily, red-headed Mike Finnegan, a Medora ne'er-do-well, was the leader of the band of thieves. Finnegan and friends were surprised by Roosevelt and his rifle-brandishing men.
Finnegan hesitated for a second, his eyes fairly wolfish. Then, as I walked up within a few paces, covering the center of his chest so as to avoid overshooting and repeating the command, he saw that he had no show, and with an oath, let his rifle drop and held his hands up beside his head.
He wanted his boat back, and remember that they stole the boat just before Roosevelt was going on a mountain lion hunt. He needed that boat for the hunt. You get in the way of Roosevelt's big game hunting, and you've caused trouble. He thought it was a matter of principle that you can't allow lawlessness out on the frontier because it will breed more lawlessness and eventually anarchy. And so he decided that he had to stake a claim for civilization by hunting down these thieves and taking them to justice. He had to build a boat. He had to pursue them through a blizzard. There were ice flows in the river. The banks were covered with mud. His food supply ran out. But in some sense, he regarded it as a lark. And when he gets to the place where the thieves are resting, it's a scene out of a dime novel. And Roosevelt is constantly casting himself in life as a kind of hero from his boyhood reading. His account of this is very heroic and dramatic. We have several other accounts of the same incident which are a little more mundane, but he was able to disarm the desperados at gunpoint. There's something in Roosevelt's character that's really interesting and hard to fathom, but he courted danger all of his life. He liked brushes with death, and this was one of them.
Roosevelt was so proud of the incident, he had the event reenacted for this photo. In another photo, Roosevelt's trusted ranch hands Sewell and Dowell posed with the recovered boat. Although he had the miscreants in hand, the road to justice was long. Low on food and in bitter cold, his ranch hands were sent home. A grueling journey to justice with prisoners began. First on the still partially frozen Little Missouri River, and then overland on a gumbo trail from Killdeer to Dickinson. To stay awake and guard his prisoners, Roosevelt reads the recently published English translation of Leo Tolstoy's masterpiece, Anna Karenina. When finished with the classic, he asks Finnegan if he has a book, and surprisingly, he does. Finnegan's book is a dime novel about Jesse James. Nevertheless, Roosevelt borrows the book and for 3 harrowing and exhausting days either walks or reads as he heads his captives to Dickinson and justice. Turning his prisoners over to the sheriff, the wealthy New Yorker proudly accepts $50 for his law enforcement efforts and then looks for a doctor to treat his badly bruised feet. Dr. Victor Stickney later wrote,
"He was all teeth and eyes, but even so, he seemed a man unusually wide awake. You could see he was thrilled by the adventures he'd been through. He did not seem to think he'd done anything particularly commendable. But he was, in his own phrase, pleased as punch at the idea of having participated in a real adventure."
On the 4th of July, 1886, Stickney invited Roosevelt to be the speaker at Dickinson's Independence Day celebration. The day began then, as now, with the parade. It was a big parade, but a local booster is quoted as saying the trouble with the parade was that everyone in town was so enthusiastic they insisted on joining the procession, and there was no one to watch except 2 men who were too drunk to notice anything. Roosevelt, in what is regarded as his first great public address, tells the assembled audience,
Like all Americans, I like big things. Big prairies, big forests and mountains, big wheat fields, railroads, and herds of cattle too. Big factories, steamboats, and everything else. But what we must keep steadily in mind is that no people were ever yet benefited by riches, if their prosperity corrupted their virtue.
Following the 4th of July Dickinson speech, Roosevelt and friend and newspaper publisher A.T. Packard traveled together back to Medora.
It's once been said that you have no idea how far you can go in American life if you look good on the back of a horse. Roosevelt learned how to look good on the back of the horse. He learned how to be a hunter's hunter. He learned how to give 4th of July speeches on Main Street towns like Dickinson that were there to unite and inspire people. It was all part of the education of this young man that was just filled with ambition. And I think it's true that Dickinson speech, if you had to do the collected speeches of Theodore Roosevelt, it'd be probably the first speech of the volume. It's the beginning of what we're going to see as this political dynamo and the emerging voice that we get to know as Theodore Roosevelt.
They came from Medora to Dickinson on a freight train, but they returned later that day on a passenger train. And as they went back to Medora, Roosevelt, proud of his speech, began to expatiate on his vision of the United States and the square deal, good government, civil service reform, America's place in the world, the need for a large navy, the need for a stronger central government. And Packard was so impressed by the deep civic mindedness of Roosevelt and his mastery of the public life of the American Constitution that he said to him, you know, I think if you really believe all of that someday you might be the President of the United States. Thus, A.T. Packard became the first person ever to predict that Roosevelt would be the president, with the possible exception of Roosevelt himself. When Roosevelt heard this, he sat up, he thought about this for a moment, he looked at Packard and he said, "I don't know if what you say is true, but if I do become the President of the United States, I shall do my best to be a very good one." It's a great moment for Roosevelt. The speech in Dickinson on the 4th of July, 1886, was the first great national speech that he ever delivered. It set the stage for all of the great orations that were to come.
Roosevelt's Dakota adventure was coming to an end. The winter of 1886-87 was one of the harshest in the history of North Dakota. There were too many cattle on the range, and with little feed, howling, cold north winds, blinding snow, and bitter cold, the cattle of the Badlands and the prairies died by the thousands. Roosevelt was caught up in the catastrophe. When he heard of the mounting losses, he rushed by train to the Badlands to assess the damage. To a friend, he wrote,
"The losses are crippling. For the first time, I have been utterly unable to enjoy a visit to any ranch. I shall be glad to get home."
Most of his cattle were dead. The great adventure was over. He had proven himself as a man among men, and now it was time to move on. He had lost half his fortune ranching in North Dakota, and he sold the few cattle that remained from his herd. Like a moth to a flame, Roosevelt returned again in 1888 and 89 to hunt. In 1890, he brought his second wife, Edith, Sister Bammy, and friends to visit his Elkhorn Ranch. He returned 5 more times before he led his famed Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in Cuba. It was a charge that was pure Roosevelt. Leading his Rough Riders and firing a pistol recovered from the sunken battleship Maine, Old Four Eyes became a national hero. He later called it "my crowded hour," the great day of my life.
Most of what was important about the Spanish-American War occurred not in Cuba, but in the Philippines. But because of Roosevelt's charisma, because of the kind of mythic quality of his life, and particularly because of the book that he wrote about it, he shot up. He said, "I rose like a rocket." And in a sense, he took over the entire narrative. And when we think of the Spanish-American War, we chiefly think of Colonel Theodore Roosevelt assaulting San Juan Hill. The qualities that he brought to that, stamina, a willingness to take risks under impossible circumstances, a kind of cowboy mentality about good and evil, those qualities were learned on his 2 ranches in Dakota Territory.
Theodore Roosevelt was a national hero. He was quickly elected governor of New York, then selected by national Republicans as the running mate for William McKinley in 1900. McKinley and Roosevelt easily won election, but in 1901, tragedy struck when McKinley was felled by an assassin's bullet. Theodore Roosevelt, at age 42, became the youngest president in U.S. history. He promoted conservation efforts, the building of the Panama Canal, and was a progressive who championed a square deal for everyone. Roosevelt returned to Medora in 1903, stopping his train there while on a visit to Yellowstone and Yosemite National Parks. The visit was brief, but friends from his ranching days turned out at the Medora Town Hall for a look at a real president. This photo was taken to commemorate the historic event. Those who might have poked fun at Old Four Eyes just a few years earlier were now awed by the presence of the President of the United States of America. Roosevelt was delighted, but also visibly moved by the presence of the men and the women who had shared his life on the frontier. He was one of them, and they would never forget one another.
I spent the happiest and most profitable years of my life here. If it had not been for what I learned in North Dakota, I would never in the world have been President of the United States.
Theodore Roosevelt died at his home in Oyster Bay, New York, at the age of 60 on January the 6th, 1919. The buffalo he shot in the Badlands still hangs in the north room of his New York home, Sagamore Hill. Shortly before he died, a New York Times reporter asked him, "How do you want to be remembered?" He answered, "I want to be remembered as a man of the West, a man of Dakota."
This program was made possible by grants from the North Dakota Humanities Council, the Southwest Rural Economic Partnership, the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame, and was produced in cooperation with Prairie Public Broadcasting. To order a DVD director's cut of this program, including bonus scenes, call the toll-free number on the screen or visit DorganFilms.com. A great gift, a treasured learning experience. Visit DorganFilms.com.